At the end of 1969, the residents of cities in Northern California were in a panic.
A mad killer, and you have no motives.
Parents were afraid to let their children out of the house, and the police were advising everyone to stay away from empty and sparsely populated places. The reason for the fear among the inhabitants of the quiet and peaceful towns in the western United States was as follows.
Zodiac. The Zodiac.
The Zodiac.
The Zodiac.
A serial killer was committing several bloody crimes. The police couldn't find the perpetrator, and then he himself sent letters to the newspapers. They contained not only details of the murders, but also cryptic codes. The messages were written by an author with an equally mysterious name, Zodiac. Months and years went by, the number of victims and letters increased, but the police had almost no suspects, and even the few they did have lacked sufficient grounds for accusation. Meanwhile, Zodiac became known across the country, was written about in newspapers, talked about on television, and even featured in Hollywood films. America officially had its own Jack the Ripper. As in the case of the famous British maniac, Zodiac would unexpectedly disappear after a few years. The killings and letters to newspapers would cease. Over half a century has passed. Zodiac remains one of the major unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. No one knows who he was, why he committed the crimes, sent letters, or where he eventually disappeared to. Some of the codes could not be deciphered for decades by either the CIA, the FBI, or numerous amateurs. Today we will delve into this case in detail. We will examine the evidence, decipher the codes, closely study all the suspects, and try to answer the main question: who is hiding behind the name Zodiac? California is a place often associated with two words, warm and sunny. However, in the north of the state, several days before Catholic Christmas, it is often quite cold. On the evening of December 20th, 68th, the temperature dropped below zero. At 8 o'clock, David Faraday picks up Betty Lou Jensen from her home. This is their first date. He's 17, she's a year younger, both are in high school, and, as is commonly said, they are well regarded. David and Betty tell their parents that they're going to a Christmas concert and will be home by 11 p.m. instead. They head to the nearby Lake Herman. Nearby are several secluded spots that could be called lovers' lanes. In essence, lovers' lanes are small open areas near the road where one can park a car and have some privacy. The existence of such places is entirely natural for a typical single-story America. Firstly, the car is the main mode of transport owned by each family. Secondly, one can get a driver's license at 16. And thirdly, it's that age when you really want to spend time away from your parents' home, but you don't have your own place yet. At 11 p.m., David and Betty still hadn't returned. At this time, their car is spotted by witnesses, young people at the same location near Lake Herman. Approximately 10 to 15 minutes later, the following occurs. Near David's car, an unknown vehicle parks from the back. A man emerges from it. He asks the young couple to step out. A man is denied, and then he pulls out a gun and begins shooting at the windows. David is seriously wounded, while Betty manages to get out of the car and run a few meters. The killer fires 5 shots at her as she flees. Approximately 10 minutes later, a woman living nearby discovers the bloody scene and calls the police. The girl is already dead, her body about 10 meters from the car. The young man inside the car is still breathing. He will die later at the hospital.
A double homicide that took place out on sometime after 11 o'clock.
Do you have any idea what the possible motive might be for this killing?
We have no motive at this time.
This crime quickly becomes what is known as a cold case. There are no witnesses who saw the perpetrator or the crime itself. In this regard, the killer is fortunate. The place is indeed secluded, but not entirely remote. There is a rather busy road nearby, constantly trafficked by cars and several farms in relative proximity. Due to the sub-zero temperature that day, detectives are unable to retrieve coherent tire or shoe prints from the killer's vehicle. Yes, they discover dozens of shell casings, determine the caliber and likely brand of the gun, but this information leads nowhere. Additionally, it is important to understand the level of security and provincial nature of the place where all this occurred. The investigator handling the case had only 2 homicides to deal with in the entire previous year. The police logic is as follows. No signs of robbery or violence were found. It is possible that the killer knew the victims, and they knew him. They begin checking out potential enemies and other jealous suitors of the girl, but everyone has alibis. The theory that local anti-social elements are responsible also leads nowhere. In short, no witnesses, no motives, no suspects. Even considering the magnitude of the event for local residents, they almost forget about it within half a year. And then a new murder occurs. Independence Day or the 4th of July, one of the major American holidays of the year. The night sky is lit with fireworks, people wave the stars and stripes and grill barbecues. The city of Vallejo is quite close to the place where the young people were murdered last Christmas. But for most locals, this is long-forgotten news. Darlene Ferrin is 22. She is a waitress at one of Vallejo's restaurants. Her husband works there as a chef. They have a small child, but the marriage is gradually falling apart. For Darlene, this is not her first marriage, and it is no secret among her close circle that she regularly has affairs. That evening, July 4th, she promises her husband that she will go out for fireworks and be back by 10 p.m. to celebrate Independence Day with friends. In reality, Darlene plans to spend time with Mike Mageau. He's a few years younger and has long had feelings for the girl. It's not exactly a romance, but the fact that they plan to spend time alone rather than with friends and family is quite telling. Darlene picks up Mike in the car and they drive to a park called Blue Rock Springs, another secluded place popular among young lovers. Their car is the only one in the parking lot. Soon another car arrives there. Mike asks Darlene if she knows the driver. She tells him not to worry. Mike's concerns are understandable. It could be the girl's husband or one of her many admirers. Almost immediately, the stranger's car leaves. However, literally 5 minutes later, it returns and stops behind the young people's car. A man emerges from it. Due to the bright light of the headlights and the flashlight in the stranger's hand, Mike cannot see him or his car clearly. His first thought is that it's a patrol officer, so he suggests to Darlene to get her documents ready. The stranger approaches the young people's car. Mike lowers the window, and the man starts shooting. Mike feels a sharp burning in his body, and hears the muffled sound of a silencer. After firing several shots at the young people, the stranger returns to his car. Only then, due to the falling headlight beams, does Mike manage to get a glimpse of the attacker. About 30 years old, stocky build, approximately 90 kilograms, and height around 176 centimeters, darkish hair, and a short military-style haircut. No glasses or moustache. At that moment, the man returns and shoots Mike 2 more times. When the killer leaves the crime scene, Mike manages to crawl out of the car. He notices that the stranger's car is of a light brown shade and has local Californian plates. The first to notice the crime scene are several teenagers passing by. They call the police. Darlene will die in the hospital. Mike is severely wounded, but he will survive and become the first to describe Zodiac to the police. About half an hour after the dispatcher at the Vallejo City Police Station received the report of the shooting and the 2 wounded, she receives a more interesting call. A man in a low monotone voice reports wanting to report a double murder. Then he describes the place where Mike and Darlene were shot, the weapon used, and its caliber. He also says that he killed those 2 people last year. At the end, he also monotonously bids farewell. The police manage to trace the call's origin. It's a payphone at a gas station located near the Vallejo City Police Department. Neither the killer nor his traces are found there. The call from the perpetrator came at about 12:40 a.m. About an hour later, phone calls start coming to Darlene's house where her friends are celebrating, as well as to her husband's parents' house. On the other end of the line, someone just breathes deeply into the receiver. Had the killer not told the police himself about the crime with 2 victims the previous Christmas, it's unlikely anyone would have connected them, although there are indeed many similar details. In both cases, everything happens on a weekend, late in the evening or at night, in a secluded place only a few kilometers apart. The victims are young couples in love. The crime scene itself offers little to the investigators. It's the late of the 1960s, and the police do not have many modern tools at their disposal, including DNA analysis. No clear tire or shoe prints are found once again, nor are there any fingerprints of the killer. What the police do have, however, is nearly a dozen shell casings, from which it is clear what weapon was used. This information does not give investigators any leads, except one. A man who called half an hour after the crime mentioned the correct caliber and type of pistol, which is information only the killer could have known. Perhaps the most important factor in this case is the surviving victim. A few days later at the hospital, Mike Mageau describes the killer's features, his car, and the details of the incident. And although he does not remember the car's license plate numbers, and theoretically the description could fit nearly a quarter of American men around 30, it is at least something. Mike tells the police that if he sees a photo of the killer, he would be able to identify him. Spoiler, he will get this chance several decades later. Despite the alleged killer's call to the Vallejo police and the report of a similar previous crime, the investigation of the July 4th murder proceeds separately. Firstly, the caller did not provide any details of the previous crime, but the fact of it was known to everyone following the news. Secondly, the cases of December 20th and July 4th fall under the responsibility of different police departments. The investigation of the Independence Day crime follows a similar scenario. Since the killer did not commit sexual assault, did not take anything valuable, and judging by the crime scene, knew the area, plus the puzzling calls to the victims' relatives, the police first begin checking those who knew the victims, and primarily Darlene Ferrin. A likely motive is the jealousy of one of her numerous admirers. The girl led a busy personal life, being married for the second time. Mike Mageau was far from the only one on her long list. Incidentally, he was wearing 3 layers of clothing that night. This fact initially alarmed investigators, but it was later revealed that the young man was embarrassed by his thinness and wanted to appear more imposing next to Darlene. Several acquaintances of the girl reported suspicious men who attempted to garner her attention. Most frequently in these statements appeared someone named Paul, with a stocky build, dark short hair, and a car resembling the one Mike Mageau described. For some time, Paul becomes the main suspect and is soon found by the police. However, the young man has an ironclad alibi for the night of July from the 4th to the 5th. Several other suspects, including police officers, also turn out to be innocent. The investigation quickly hits a dead end. The only thing that can be said with some certainty, judging by the killer's call, the police are dealing with a maniac. Who else would recount their own crime? But where and how to find the maniac remains unclear. And here, the perpetrator loudly announces himself. Nearly a month after the crime, the editorial offices of 3 newspapers from the San Francisco area receive strange letters. On the envelope, the inscription reads, "Urgent to the editor." Inside are messages in which a person claims responsibility for the murders of Darlene Ferrin, Betty Lou Jensen, and David Faraday. It becomes almost immediately clear that the author of the letter is indeed the killer. In the text, he lists the exact type of weapon used in each instance, the number of shots fired, and what the victims were wearing. This is information that was not available to the public. 2 aspects make these letters even more intriguing. The signature of the author in the form of a symbol resembling a kind of target, as well as an enigmatic code. It consists of 3 parts. The killer sends one part to each of the newspapers. Allegedly, the strange symbols conceal the killer's real name. Moreover, the author of the messages threatens to kill more than a dozen people if the codes are not printed on the front pages of the publications. And if, after the strange call to the police of the city of Vallejo, there was a strong suspicion that the crime was the work of a maniac, then after the letters to the newspapers, it becomes obvious. Since the times of the infamous Jack the Ripper, this is the first killer who sends messages to the press with details of his deeds. The editors, who received the letters with the codes, face two main problems. First, no one knows what the killer attempted to communicate with the symbols. Neither the police nor the CIA managed to quickly decode the messages. Indeed, it is unlikely that the best agents of the United States Secret Services would be working on it at the moment. After all, the incident concerns a relatively small area of the state of California, not the entire country. However, nonetheless, the second problem for the newspaper editors is a moral choice. Not printing the codes at the criminals' demand means potentially endangering the lives of more than a dozen people. On the other hand, publishing such content could incite panic. Ultimately, after 2 days on Sunday, the publication prints the codes and part of the criminals' messages. This generates incredible interest among local residents. Everyone can feel like a detective. Well, let's do the same. Decoding the codes is, after all, a very fascinating topic. Let's start with the fact that the word cipher traces its roots back to Hebrew and means to number. The traditional cipher implies that each letter is replaced with a sign or symbol. The 3 parts of the cipher, sent by the killer to the newspapers, consist of 8 lines, 18 symbols each. The symbols are completely different. Greek signs, semaphore alphabet, astrological symbols, and letters of the alphabet. The complexity also lies in the fact that it is not clear which part of the code is the first in the message, which is the second, and which is the third. One thing is almost certainly known. Since the author is a native English speaker, the letters of the English alphabet are encrypted within. And in any language there are certain rules and patterns. English is no exception. There are words consisting only of 1 letter, for instance, I. There are words consisting of 2 letters, and in such words there will always be 1 vowel and 1 consonant. There are letters that appear in words most often. These are E, T, and AA, and so on. In short, you roughly understand the rules of decoding for dummies. In theory it sounds simple, but the fact that law enforcement can't quickly decode the criminal's code means it is much more complex. For example, the Zodiac used significantly more symbols than there are letters in the alphabet. This means that each letter could be replaced by several symbols at once. Thanks to publication in the press, many amateurs took up the decryption. As a result, a history teacher from Northern California and his wife managed to unravel the code. 2 main keys for the couple were the following. In their opinion, the word I likely starts the message. Considering the killer's behavior, specifically his message to the press, it was important for him to make himself known. He had a significant ego. The second important key is the word kill. Most likely, this cipher uses it more than once, and it contains a double letter. After that, it's a matter of technique and patience. Spending almost a full day without rest, the couple was able to fully read the criminal's message. It begins with the phrase, "I like killing people because it brings me joy." The criminal also states in the text that he will continue to kill and will not reveal his name because, in that case, law enforcement will stop him. From the text, it becomes even more obvious. The police are dealing with a maniac. Murder is his only motive. Another interesting aspect of the message consists of the last 18 symbols. Using the logic of the cipher, the history teacher and his wife understood what these letters are, but the problem is that they make no sense. These 18 symbols have still not been deciphered. Some still believe it is the killer's name. Several assumptions were made, but for them to work, part of the letters must either be added or corrected. This generally has some logic, as there were several mistakes in the criminal's main code as well. However, all resulting variants have led nowhere in 50 years. Another popular version is that it is a random set of 18 symbols, which the killer needed only to make all three parts of the code absolutely equal. Interestingly, after the teacher and his wife deciphered the code, they of course called the newspaper to report it. At first, they were not believed. Not only could the CIA and FBI not do it, but hundreds of amateurs had begun harassing the editorial office with their incorrect versions. However, in the end, the code decrypted by the couple was still printed in the newspapers. But even before the decoded cipher was published, a new message from the mysterious killer arrived at the editorial office. He sent it in response to the public demand of the chief of police of the city of Vallejo to provide more details that would prove he was the one who committed the crimes. The killer enumerates several facts about what happened in December of '68 and July of '69. They pertain to the victim's vehicle, the victims themselves, and other details of the crime. None of this information was publicly available, and only the killer could have known it. But the most interesting detail of the second message is as follows. It begins with the phrase, "Dear editor, this is the Zodiac speaking." He calls himself by this nickname for the first time. So by August 1969, the police have 2 murders and 2 letters from the perpetrator. Handwriting experts confirm that both messages are from the same person. The investigators' hopes that the Zodiac would reveal his identity in the letters or provide some other clues are not realized. However, it cannot be denied that the letters still contain interesting details that might convey something about the criminal. The code was likely composed by an amateur, not a professional. The thing is, the principles of the code, and even many of the symbols, the author apparently took from popular cryptography books for enthusiasts. These are code breakers and codes and ciphers. The latter even discusses a medieval alphabetic code called the Zodiac alphabet. This interesting detail was discovered by Robert Graysmith, an illustrator who, at the time of the Zodiac's emergence, was working at the San Francisco Chronicle, one of the publications to which the Zodiac sent his letters. Robert also discovers that, by a remarkable coincidence, these very books went missing from several libraries in the settlements around San Francisco. The investigation is also intrigued by the message in the text about the belief that when the killer dies, he will be reborn in paradise and will need the souls of slaves there, and that he calls humans the most dangerous animal of all. The former suggests that the Zodiac may be a member of some satanic cult. The latter is a direct quote from an early of the 1930s film called The Most Dangerous Game, where the protagonist hunts humans for sport. However, none of these leads result in outcomes at the time. One of the notable features of the message is also that the criminal makes spelling mistakes, sometimes in elementary words. He may be poorly educated or may be trying to further confuse the police. However, despite the mistakes, the killer manages to convey a special message. He has already committed several crimes and does not intend to stop. The police and the residents of California will be convinced of this in less than 2 months. On that day, Cecilia Ann Shepard and Brian Hartnell are spending time at Lake Berryessa, a quiet, peaceful place in Northern California, relatively close to San Francisco, and the Zodiac's 2 previous crimes. When Brian parked the car in the lot near the lake around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the area was empty. For some time, the young couple is alone near the water. Suddenly, Cecilia notices a large man about 200 meters away from them, hiding behind the trees. When the man approaches closer, he is wearing a dark suit, with the very same Zodiac target symbol from the letter on his chest, and something resembling a medieval dark hood with eye slits on his head. The man is wearing dark glasses, and in his hands is a gun. Brian's first thought is that they are about to be robbed, but he only has some change with him. He tells the man that he can get money later, but the assailant is not interested in money. He pulls out ropes and tells the girl to tie Brian's hands, who is lying face down on the ground. Then the assailant himself ties Cecilia's hands. During this time, the young man and the criminal have a rather chaotic conversation. Zodiac reveals that he escaped from prison in Montana, killing several guards in the process, and is now on his way to Mexico. After this, the criminal takes a knife, inflicts several knife wounds on each of the young people, and leaves. A father and son fishing on a boat hear the screams, see the victims, and report the incident to a park ranger. Upon arriving at the scene, the police find Cecilia and Brian still alive. As in the previous case, the girl will die in the hospital, but the young man survives. An hour later, a call comes to the Napa County Police Station, where the lake is located. In a monotonous, low voice, a man says he wants to report a murder, specifically a double murder. He states where it happened and that he did it, then hangs up. Police trace the payphone from which the call was made, find several fingerprints there, which, upon examination, lead nowhere. However, the police do find the young people's car. On its door are written the dates of the Zodiac's previous 2 crimes, the city name of Vallejo, as well as the date of the new murder and the weapon with which it was committed, a knife. In addition, the already familiar symbol of the maniac can be seen on the car. Thus, the police almost have no doubt that this is a new crime of the Zodiac. In this case, the killer left much more information about himself for the investigators compared to previous cases. Judging by the call to the police station, Zodiac was confident that none of the victims survived. But Brian Hartnell manages to do so and provides the police with a detailed description of the masked man and their conversation. And although the information that the killer supposedly escaped from prison in Montana is not confirmed, and turns out to be a fabrication, the police at least have a visual description of a not very tall but large man in a medieval hood, glasses, and a large symbol on his chest. This masquerade is also intriguing for another reason. The killer apparently thought that no one would be left alive. This is indicated by his call to the police and the number of stab wounds inflicted. Why then such an elaborate costume? However, despite the mask, the police managed to get a description of the face of a man who is likely the criminal. The matter is that earlier that same day, several young women relaxing at the lake saw a suspicious man watching them. Age between 25 to 35, approximately 1 meter 80 in height, with a solid build of around 100 kilograms, short, dark hair, smoking. This description matches what Cecilia managed to report while she was still conscious in the hospital. She saw the killer before he put on the mask. Additionally, investigators discover tracks leading from the crime scene to where the Zodiac presumably parked his car. And these tracks are quite interesting. Firstly, judging by their depth, the man's weight was indeed around 100 kilograms, with a foot size of 44. Secondly, the shoes leaving such tracks are not available in regular stores. Investigators determined that similar boots were produced by order of the military in a quantity of just over 100,000 and could only be purchased by military personnel on their bases. This indicates that the killer is either an active member of the armed forces or was recently so. Another argument supporting this version is that the Zodiac apparently had a good command of weapons. This is particularly evident from the first crime in December of '68, when one of the victims was fleeing in the dark and he fired after her. Besides the specific details and evidence found by the police by the end of September of '69, a rough psychological profile of the killer emerges. He attacks young couples, displaying more cruelty towards the women. This is why, in the last 2 cases, the young men survived. Based on this, it can be said that the killer most likely experiences significant personal life problems, thus expressing his own dissatisfaction. The perpetrator likely lives alone or with parents. The crime locations, specifically quiet, secluded spots where lovers can be found, located not far from each other, suggest that the Zodiac is probably local and knows the area well. Meanwhile, residents of the regions where the crimes occurred begin to avoid quiet, deserted places, and parents keep teenagers at home until the maniac is caught. Now the police have much more data on the perpetrator and potential leads, and the only question is whether they will manage to catch the Zodiac before he commits another crime. 2 weeks pass after the murder at Lake Berryessa. Paul Stein is about 30 years old. He works part-time as a taxi driver to pay for his college tuition. On a Saturday evening around 9:30, he picks up a passenger on a busy street in San Francisco and drives north to a prestigious residential area. The passenger is a young, heavily built man. Upon reaching the destination, the driver goes an extra block. Likely, the passenger requests this. Ultimately, around 10, the police will find Paul Stein shot dead in his cab. 2 teenagers become key witnesses to the crime. They witnessed the murder with their own eyes from the window of the second floor of the house across the street. During a call to the police dispatcher, they report seeing a large man who first leaned over as if wiping down the interior from the passenger side door, then walked around the car and searched the victim from the driver's side door, and then turned and walked north toward the park. There is some confusion between the dispatcher's conversation with the teenagers and the message relayed to the police patrols. For some reason, according to the first description given to the patrol officers, the suspect was identified as black, which is why when 2 officers encounter a large white man walking near the crime scene 5 minutes after the report of the crime, they merely ask if he has seen anyone suspicious. He points in the opposite direction and says that a man with a gun ran that way. The description is quickly corrected to a large white man with short hair, but the suspect is not found, despite the large number of police officers flooding the area. An hour later, Inspector Dave Toschi arrives at the crime scene with his partner. Toschi is considered one of San Francisco's best detectives and certainly the most charismatic among them. Dave knows well that a crime scene can reveal a lot. Initially, what happened does not seem very unusual. Robberies and murders of taxi drivers in a large city like San Francisco are not uncommon. This was not the driver's first trip of the night, so he likely had several dozen dollars in his pocket, which the killer took. It is indeed strange, however, that the perpetrator did not take the victim's watch and ring. The crime scene and witness interviews provide the investigation with 2 main clues. The first is a bloody fingerprint on the front passenger seat. A few days later, analysis confirms that the fingerprint does not belong to the driver. This means it was most likely left by the killer. The other crucial piece of information for the police is the sketch of the suspect. Several witnesses saw him, the teenagers and the patrol officers, a man between 25 and 35 years old, approximately 177 centimeters tall, with a stocky build, dark jacket and pants, glasses and short dark hair. Based on these statements, the perhaps most famous images of the Zodiac are created. However, at that moment, no one yet attributes this crime to the serial killer. This will only happen 3 days after the murder. A letter arrives at the editorial office of the San Francisco Chronicle. It begins with the now well-known phrase, "This is the Zodiac speaking," ends with the already known cross-circle symbol, and contains details of the taxi driver's murder unknown to the general public. But most importantly, the letter includes undeniable proof of the author's involvement in the crime, a piece of the victim's bloodied shirt. Besides the fact that detectives confirmed that the piece of the shirt indeed belonged to the taxi driver, they hand over the letter for analysis. Experts confirm that this message was written by the same person who authored the previous Zodiac letters. The spoiler is far from the last letter from the maniac. Each of them will undergo examination, and it's probably worth clarifying right away that handwriting analysis is a much more complex process than just saying it looks similar or not. In the process of learning to write, each of us develops unique features, and then we subconsciously repeat them over and over. By features, several dozen individual handwriting details are meant: size, slant, spacing between words, the degree of pressure on the paper, the number of movements involved in writing a particular letter, and so on. A person can try to change their handwriting, but still a large number of details inherent only to them will remain. Therefore, experts can very accurately determine whether letters were written by the same person or different individuals. Besides authorship, the letter with details of the taxi driver's murder is notable in that panic in Northern California begins right after its release. The fact is that in the message, Zodiac hints at an attack on a school bus. Since the letter is printed on the pages of the main local newspaper, San Francisco Chronicle, it becomes known to the public. After the letter and the killer's drawing are published, police receive hundreds of calls. Some claim to have seen Zodiac, others say they know Zodiac, and still others claim they are Zodiac. None of the calls lead to a capture or new information about the maniac. In several areas of Northern California where Zodiac's crimes occurred, buses transport tens of thousands of students daily. Volunteers and additional police forces are immediately organized to patrol every school bus. Images of the suspect are sent to all taxi fleets in San Francisco and nearby areas. Few doubt that Zodiac will strike again. The only question is where and how. 11 days after the taxi driver's murder, a call comes into the Oakland Police Department, a city adjacent to San Francisco. It begins with the phrase, "This is Zodiac speaking." The man goes on to say that he wants to contact a couple of well-known lawyers and talk to one of them on the phone during a local TV evening program. One of the named lawyers, Melvin Belli, agrees to do it. Belli often defends various celebrities in court and thus is a bit of a celebrity himself, his face familiar to the public. That same day at 7 p.m, a program airs live with Belli present. They await Zodiac's call. He calls 20 minutes later. It turns into a rather chaotic conversation. The man calling himself Zodiac will call about 35 times, each time quickly hanging up. The police believe that he does this so that his call cannot be traced. When Belli asks how he might address him other than the ominous nickname Zodiac, he asks to be called Sam. From this conversation we learn little about the interlocutor. Mostly Belli speaks, and Sam gives monosyllabic answers. He confesses to experiencing headaches, fearing being caught in a gas chamber, and that he will carry out his threats regarding school buses. The conversation ends with Belli and Sam arranging to meet privately in one of the city's temples. The meeting can hardly be called private, as alongside the lawyer, a slew of press and police arrive. Sam does not show up. Several people who have heard the Zodiac's voice in person, including a police dispatcher, a patrol officer, and the survivor, Brian Hartnell, are invited to listen to the recording of the television program. They recognize Sam's voice as too high-pitched and unsure, unlike the real Zodiac. Shortly thereafter, the police manage to trace the call to the television studio. The so-called Sam turns out to be a patient of a local psychiatric hospital. About 3 weeks pass after the television interview. New messages from the Zodiac arrive at the San Francisco Chronicle. The authorship is once again confirmed by an expert. In these letters, the maniac reports 2 murders in August of the same year. These are crimes that the police had not attributed to the Zodiac. Investigators start to go through unsolved cases, and the most fitting turns out to be the murder of 2 girls in San Jose, a city near San Francisco. The victims had stab wounds. Overall, the crime resembled the attack at Lake Berryessa, which occurred later in September, the one with the hood and glasses. However, the immediate question arises, why did the killer not write the August crime dates on the car door? There were only 3 dates there which the police knew about. Skipping ahead, it is worth noting that the San Jose crime will be solved 2 years later. The perpetrator turns out to be a teenager, not the Zodiac. Another interesting aspect of the letters is the new threats regarding school buses. This time, the message includes a detailed diagram of an explosive device. According to the Zodiac, he keeps all the necessary materials in his basement. This is a very interesting fact because, as we have found, the maniac is most likely based in Northern California. In this state, Basements in houses are not a common feature due to soil characteristics and frequent earthquakes. The Zodiac also states that his image based on witness testimony does not correspond to reality at all, and he looks different. Due to the fact that a lot of lies are circulating about him in the press, he claims he will likely change his tactics and now disguise his crimes as household robberies and accidents. Finally, with one of the messages is attached the famous cipher 340, named for the number of symbols it contains. For half a century, representatives of special services and numerous enthusiasts attempted to decode it. News frequently emerged, claiming the code's decryption, but subsequent verification showed the solutions were incorrect. Many believed that the cipher 340 contained the killer's name. Only in the year 2020 did several enthusiasts manage to decrypt the code using mathematical equations and computer algorithms. It turned out to contain no interesting information. In it, Zodiac mentions a previous TV interview with a patient from an asylum and once again makes satanic statements about paradise after death and other things. The next letter at the end of December 1969, Zodiac sends directly to the lawyer Melvin Belli. There he speaks about his new victim, which would amount to a total of 8. However, the police are unable to find any unsolved crimes that could be linked to the Zodiac. Essentially, after the killing of the taxi driver in San Francisco, almost half a year will pass before the famous serial killer commits another crime. Late in the evening, around 11 o'clock, 22-year-old Caitlin Jones is driving on a road near the city of Modesto in Northern California. In the car is her 10-month-old child, and Caitlin herself is pregnant. She notices that the car behind is signaling her with its headlights. A man gets out of the car behind her, and he tells Caitlin that one of her wheels is wobbling and that he can help tighten it. After the stranger fixes the issue, he drives off. As soon as Caitlin resumes driving, that very wheel completely falls off. The stranger reverses and offers to give Caitlin a lift to the nearest service station. It's only half a kilometre away. The girl agrees, but the man does not stop at the nearest station and continues driving. Sitting in the car, Caitlin can see him well. About 6 feet tall, large build, dark jacket, short hair, dark hair, glasses. The stranger's boots remind Caitlin of military ones. During the conversation, the stranger informs Caitlin that he is going to kill her. Waiting for the man to slow down at one of the stop signs, she jumps out of the car with her baby, and here she is lucky. A truck was passing by, and the stranger's car blocked its path. He got out to find Caitlin, who had fallen into a ditch by the road. Ultimately, the mysterious man decides not to take the risk and drives away. Already at the police station, Caitlin Jones sees that well-known Zodiac sketch and claims that it was indeed the person who abducted her. The woman herself is in a state of shock. Later, the police find the woman's car. The interior is burned from the inside. The incidents involving Caitlin Jones are most frequently attributed to the Zodiac's crimes. Not only did the woman describe someone visually similar to the maniac, but he himself later sent a letter in which he talked about the attack and the victim's burned car. On the other hand, the following suspicious details cannot be overlooked. Firstly, the crime itself strongly stands out from the Zodiac's behavior patterns. Secondly, the maniac takes responsibility for this event in a letter that reached the newspapers only 4 months after the incident. Even though for all these 4 months, new letters continued arriving from him, and information about the attack on Caitlin was already in a small local newspaper. That is, he could have simply read about it. In a word, among the numerous Zodiac researchers, this case sparks controversy. Many claim that here the killer merely takes responsibility for other people's crimes, something that has happened to him before. Nevertheless, the more generally accepted version is that this crime is indeed the work of the Zodiac. The very letter where the maniac speaks of the case with Caitlin Jones is already the 14th letter in the count. Throughout the year 1970, the Zodiac continues his messages, handwriting experts also lean towards the idea that the author is the same. In the new letters there is nothing particularly new. The same old threats of blowing up buses, the author's demands that the residents of San Francisco start wearing badges with his logo, small pieces of cipher that remain undeciphered to this day, as well as statements that the number of his victims is already 13, although at that time only 5 are still officially confirmed by the police. Gradually, Dave Toschi, who remains one of the main figures in the investigation, and others involved, start to think that the Zodiac is merely attributing a new crime to himself on paper. It is even possible that part of his letters are the work of a copycat. Since none of the Zodiac's new threats materialize, gradually by the end of the year 1970, the frenzy around the maniac begins to fade despite the letters. And then news emerges of a new crime by the serial killer. However, this crime is from the distant past. Paul Avery, in the late 60s, early 70s, is one of the main investigative journalists for the San Francisco Chronicle. Naturally, he writes most of the articles about the Zodiac in the publication. The 15th letter from the serial killer at the end of October 1970 is addressed directly to Paul. It contains a card with a skeleton and a short message, which includes the words "You are doomed" and 14. Thus, the author likely hints that the journalist will be his next 14th victim. Avery starts carrying a gun, and some of his colleagues wear badges saying, "I am not Paul Avery." However, the most significant thing is not this. The San Francisco Chronicle prints the letter threatening their journalist. In response, an anonymous reader sends a letter claiming that the Zodiac's crime started significantly earlier than Christmas of '68. The town of Riverside is located in the southern part of the state of California. Cherie Jo Bates is a freshman at a local college. In the evening of October 30th, 1966, she goes to the library, and her body with stab wounds is found early the next morning not far from the library building. The local police conclude that the girl most likely knew the killer, as several hours passed since she left the library until her death. Investigators think that they spent this time together. Near the body, a watch is discovered, which the victim likely tore off the killer during the struggle. Also found at the scene are traces of shoe sizes 9. Both the brand of the watch and the type of shoes suggest that the killer might be military, as primarily such models were worn by them. However, checks of personnel at the nearest military base lead to no results. Local police officers admit that they have a serious suspect but insufficient grounds for action. Thus, this crime becomes the first unsolved murder for the town of Riverside. A month later, identical typewritten letters arrive at the local newspaper's office and the police department. In them, the author confesses to the girl's murder, stating it was revenge for her rejecting him. The letter also contains certain details of the crime. Several more weeks pass, and the janitor of the same library in Riverside discovers a poem written in dark pen on the underside of a table. It is about blood, the girl's death, and ends with the initials R and H. 6 months later, 3 identical letters are received by the girl's parents, the local newspaper, and the police. The message is brief. Bates had to die. There will be more. At the end, either the number 2, a random scribble of the letter Z. Paul Avery publishes an article linking the Riverside murder to the Zodiac's crimes. According to the journalist, experts confirm that the handwriting in the Riverside letters matches the handwriting in the Zodiac's last letters. However, to be precise, experts did not find complete identity. They discovered some similarities, but also differences. Almost 6 months after Avery's article is published, a letter from the Zodiac arrives, claiming responsibility for Riverside. However, it does not mention details that were not already in the media. At that time, most investigators are convinced that the Zodiac has long been claiming other people's murders, and the Riverside case is no exception. by the end of 1971, only the image of the terrifying maniac remains. No new crimes occur, the number of letters significantly drops, and even letters from copycats almost cease, although at their peak, up to a dozen could arrive in a week. However, several films about the Zodiac are released over a couple of years. The most famous is the action film Dirty Harry from 1971, starring Clint Eastwood. His character, a San Francisco police inspector, searches for a maniac called Scorpio, who sends threatening letters. It's hard not to see the analogy. Zodiac will disappear for a few years and return only in early 1974. Then he sends his last letter, which experts consider genuine. In it, the maniac states that he watched the newly released film The Exorcist and notes the number 37, hinting at the significantly increased number of his victims. Yes, the killer once promised that he would disguise his deeds as accidents or domestic incidents. However, there is no data to support the claim that such a number of murdered victims is true. The maniac himself does not provide this evidence, and there are no unsolved cases potentially linked to the Zodiac. In the 1970s and even into the 1980s, rare messages purportedly from the Zodiac were sent to newspaper offices in various parts of the United States with reports of allegedly new crimes. However, neither experts nor the police considered these messages authentic. At the beginning of the 1990s, a serial killer began operating in New York. He sent letters to a local newspaper and the police. The message began with the phrase, "This is the Zodiac." In the letters, the author claimed he was the infamous California maniac and intended to kill 12 people, according to the number of zodiac signs. The trademark logo was also present in the message. The handwriting in the letter, however, was not confirmed by experts, and even without being a professional, one could say that it did not seem like the real Zodiac. Nonetheless, the promised crimes began to occur. Several people were wounded and several were killed. It took the police 5 years to catch the culprit. The perpetrator turned out to be a 28-year-old man obsessed with the Bible, astrology, and weapons. He confessed to all the crimes, and his fingerprints matched the evidence. Considering the age of the perpetrator, it was obvious that he was not the one operating in California, but then, who was? Over the years and decades of investigation, thousands of people were checked or interrogated by the police. However, only a few were seriously considered suspects, and now it is time to talk about them. Years after the incident, Caitlin Jones identified this person from a photo. According to her, he kidnapped her with her child in March of the 70th year. The photographs were shown to Caitlin by one of the California police officers, who was not directly involved in the investigation of the Zodiac cases, but became very interested in the story. Lawrence Kane came under the officer's scrutiny due to several minor arrests related to voyeurism and because of a psychological profile. He had a complex relationship with women. Additionally, Kane visually matched the description of the Zodiac. The results of his handwriting analysis were contradictory. On the one hand, they did not confirm an exact match with the Zodiac letters, but they did not completely rule him out either. Other arguments in favor of the Kane as Zodiac theory were stories from the babysitter and some colleagues of Darlene Ferrin. They allegedly recognized Kane as the man who had been following the girl for months. The problem was that all their suspicions were expressed several years after the murder, and only to journalists, not to the police. According to the California officer, Kane was also responsible for another murder not officially attributed to the Zodiac. It occurred in 1970 in a neighboring state, and the victim was a girl who once worked with Kane. In the late 1990s, the officer from California sent the results of his amateur investigation to the police, but they were not enough. Lawrence Kane was never officially arrested or charged with the Zodiac crimes. Rick Marshall worked as a radio engineer and also as a cinema operator, where old films were shown. So, theoretically, he could have known that very film from the early 30s, The Most Dangerous Game, which the Zodiac quoted: dense build, glasses in dark frames and short dark hair. Some of his acquaintances claimed that in the mid-60s, Marshall lived in Riverside, the site of Sherry Joe Bates's murder. And in the late 60s, he moved to San Francisco, where he lived in a basement, near the site of the murder of taxi driver Paul Stein. Rick Marshall became one of the suspects thanks to anonymous tips to the police. Napa detective from California, Ken Narlow, who spent several decades on the Zodiac case, also checked into suspect Rick Marshall, but eventually excluded him from the list as his fingerprints did not match any of the prints the police attributed to the Zodiac. Ross Sullivan began to be seriously considered as the potential Zodiac quite recently. Journalists were able to find out that he was the main suspect in the Sherry Joe Bates murder from Riverside in '66. Let me remind you, back then the local police had a serious suspect, but for a long time his name was unknown. In '66, Sullivan was working as an assistant in the Riverside Library next to where the crime took place. According to acquaintances, he was a quiet guy, wearing army clothing and also army boots. Moreover, Sullivan resembled the Zodiac sketches. But was he really him? Hardly. There is no substantial evidence linking Sullivan to Bates's murder, let alone the other 5 crimes that are officially attributed to the Zodiac. At the end of 2021, numerous headlines appeared online that can be summed up under one denominator. The true identity of the Zodiac has finally been revealed. It is about an investigation by a group called the Case Breakers. According to the leaders of the organization, it is composed of 4 former law enforcement personnel, and the team's main activity is investigating those very cold cases, unsolved crimes. According to group representatives, over several years they analyzed a huge amount of documents and data on the Zodiac and concluded that it was Gary Post. A former military man lived very close to the murder site in Riverside in '66, wore army footwear, which is logical for a former serviceman. According to the investigators, he not only looked like the Zodiac but also had a scar on his forehead, as in one of the well-known witness sketches. Furthermore, the investigators claim that Post's name appears in the Zodiac ciphers. And finally, he allegedly has links not only to the official Zodiac murders, but also to several other crimes. Law enforcement, still officially investigating the Zodiac crimes, stated that the evidence provided by the group regarding Gary Post is not substantial. And finally, we arrive at the suspect whom many consider to be the real California maniac. At the end of October in the year 1966, the murder of Sherry Joe Bates occurred in Riverside, in the southern part of the state of California. Allen recounted that he was in the southern part of the state at that time, although he worked and lived in the northern part of California. On the 20th of December 1968, the murder of teenagers on Christmas occurred, marking the first official crime of the Zodiac. At that moment, Allen was living in the city of Vallejo, just 7 minutes away from the crime scene. On the 4th of July 1969, the murder of Darlene Ferrin took place, with Allen residing even closer to the crime scene. On the September 27th, 1969, the murder at Lake Berryessa occurred. Allen claimed that he was at home at that moment, but no one could either confirm or refute his alibi. Towards the end of the decade, in 1974, no official Zodiac murders occurred during this period. During this time, Allen was studying at a college in the city of Sonoma near San Francisco. In the year 1974, Allen was accused of corrupting a minor and was arrested. Confirmed Zodiac letters ceased. This is quite significant, you'll agree. And that's not all. For the first time, Allen came under police scrutiny in connection with the murder of Cecilia Shepard at Lake Berryessa in September 1969, when he was working as a janitor at a school in the city of Vallejo nearby. Allen was a former military man, a large man with thinning dark hair, weighing over 100 kilograms and standing about 180 centimeters tall. Allen could not provide an alibi for the time of Shepard's murder on the 27th of September. He only said that he was at home and did not remember if his parents were home at that time. A little over a year later, Allen was once again at the center of police attention. Detective Dave Toschi received information from one of the police departments in California. Two men approached them, claiming that several years before the Zodiac's activity began, they were acquainted with Lee Allen. And he had told them about his ideas to start killing people, then send letters to the police with details and sign them as the Zodiac. Allen already had minor legal issues in the 1960s. For instance, once he was fired from a job at a school for bringing a weapon there, and another time supposedly for inappropriate behavior with students. Dave Toschi and colleagues spoke with Lee Allen in the year 1971. He denied ever discussing murders and letters with acquaintances. During the meeting, Allen had a Zodiac brand watch with the familiar logo. Allen said the watch was a gift from his mother a few years prior. There were witnesses who claimed to have seen the Zodiac symbol at Allen's home. Incidentally, it is still unclear what the Zodiac symbol meant or where it was taken from. Perhaps from the watch, perhaps it was an astrological symbol or medieval, or possibly a crosshair. One way or another, gradually the police found more and more reasons to believe that Allen was indeed the Zodiac. He owned weapons, including those models from which several crimes were committed. In a word, for the police, Arthur Lee Allen became the main suspect. They were able to obtain permission to search the trailer in which he lived, but found nothing there linking Allen to the Zodiac. A handwriting expert concluded that Allen was not the author of the Zodiac letters, and his fingerprints did not match those found in the car of the murdered taxi driver. Consequently, the police had nothing to charge Allen with. However, 2 decades later, in the early 1990s, he once again came under the scrutiny of law enforcement. Thanks to a tip from an informant, police obtained permission to search Allen's home. They found weapons belonging to him, yet this did nothing to prove he was the Zodiac. The suspect himself claimed he was being accused of something he did not commit. Finally, around that same time, one of the former detectives from the city of Vallejo located Mike Margot, a survivor of the July 4th crime, and showed him photos of several suspects, among whom was Allen. Margot pointed to Allen and said that it was this man who shot him. However, he cautioned that he didn't see the killer very well due to the bright headlights. Moreover, it should be noted that 2 decades had passed since the crime, and Mike Margot struggled with various addictions. Allen died just a year after the police encounter with Mike Margot. Robert Graysmith, once an illustrator for the San Francisco Chronicle and one of the primary investigators of the Zodiac case, wrote several bestsellers about this story, which formed the basis of a Hollywood film starring Robert Downey Jr. and Jake Gyllenhaal. In summary, Graysmith is convinced of Allen's guilt despite the lack of truly compelling evidence and proof. The Zodiac became the Jack the Ripper of the 20th century, with both having 5 generally accepted victims, although there is significantly less certainty regarding the Rippers due to the passage of time. Thus, neither was clearly the most brutal serial killer in history, and yet they are the most famous. The reason is that they were never caught. As for the Zodiac, 50 years later, his case seems perhaps more extensive than it originally was. After all the murders at the time were mainly handled by local police departments rather than agencies like the FBI. This was possibly one of the reasons he wasn't caught. Police departments couldn't communicate effectively with each other, each primarily dealing with its own crime, which ultimately hindered the overall investigation. Many of those who examined the Zodiac case had their main suspect. Some are convinced it was Rick Marshall, others Ross Sullivan, others Arthur Lee Allen, and so on. The investigators' certainty could be 80, 90, or even 99%, yet there always remained at least a fraction of doubt. And here the main question is whether this certainty will ever reach 100%. And in this regard, I am deeply skeptical.